The wedding dress hung in Elizabeth Morrison's chamber like a ghost of expectations, white silk imported from Boston, pearl buttons that caught the morning light, and a train long enough to sweep the floor of the finest church in Fort Detroit. In 3 days, she would wear it to marry Captain James Whitmore, the most eligible bachelor in the Michigan Territory. But as she stared at the gown that represented everything her family had worked toward, Elizabeth felt nothing but dread settling. In her chest like winter fog over Lake Huron, what she didn't know was that in 2 days, everything would change. A Huron warrior named Thomas Blackhawk would be brought to the fort as a prisoner, and their eyes would meet across a crowded courtyard, setting in motion events that would scandalize colonial society and prove that love recognizes no boundaries, not race, not politics, not the bitter hatred between two peoples at war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1763 painted the Michigan wilderness in shades of fire and gold. But inside Fort Detroit, the only colors that mattered were the blue of military uniforms and the white of surrender flags. Elizabeth Morrison stood at her bedroom window, watching smoke rise from the distant Huron villages across the Detroit River, knowing that each column of gray represented another life disrupted by the endless cycle of conflict between the British colonists and the native tribes. At 22, Elizabeth possessed the kind of refined beauty that made mothers clutch their unmarried sons closer at social gatherings. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like burnished copper, and her green eyes held an intelligence that some found attractive and others deemed inappropriate for a woman of her station. She had been educated beyond what most considered necessary for a frontier bride. She could read Latin as well as French, discuss politics with the passion of a diplomat, and manage household accounts with the precision of a trained clerk. Father, Colonel Robert Morrison, commanded Fort Detroit with an iron will that had kept the British stronghold secure through 3 years of intermittent warfare with Pontiac's Confederation of Tribes. He was a career military man who had served in campaigns from the Caribbean to the Canadian frontier, earning his position through competence rather than connections. His weathered face bore scars from battles fought in service to the crown, and his gray eyes missed nothing that happened within his domain. "Elizabeth," he called from the doorway of her chamber, his voice carrying the authority that made seasoned soldiers snap to attention. "Captain Whitmore has arrived for dinner. Your mother expects you in the parlor within the quarter hour." She turned from the window, smoothing the emerald silk of her best dress, a gown that had cost more than most families in the territory earned in a year. The fabric had been shipped from London specifically for her engagement announcement, and wearing it felt like donning armor for a battle she had no desire to fight. Captain James Whitmore represented everything her parents had hoped for in a son-in-law. At 30, he commanded his own company of British regulars, possessed a substantial inheritance from his family's shipping interests in Massachusetts, and carried himself with the confident bearing of a man destined for higher rank. His blonde hair was always perfectly groomed, his uniform pressed to military precision, and his blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. The Morrison family dining room reflected their status within the fort's hierarchy. Crystal glasses caught the light from silver candelabras, and the mahogany table had been carried piece by piece through the wilderness from Albany. Tonight, it was set for Elizabeth, her parents, and the man who would soon become her husband, whether she wished it or not. "Elizabeth, my dear." Captain Whitmore rose as she entered, his smile practiced and appropriate. "You look lovely this evening. That shade of green complements your eyes beautifully." The compliment was correct but felt rehearsed, like every other interaction they had shared during their 6-month courtship. James was unfailingly polite, properly attentive, and utterly predictable. He never surprised her with an unexpected thought or challenged her with a difficult question. Their conversations followed patterns as rigid as military drill formations. "Thank you, Captain," she replied, accepting his hand as he seated her. "I trust your patrol along the river went well today?" "Indeed it did. We encountered no hostile activity, though our scouts report increased movement in the Huron camps across. The water, nothing to concern yourself with, of course." Colonel Morrison carved the roast beef with military precision, while his wife, Margaret, maintained the kind of cheerful conversation that kept dinner parties moving smoothly. Margaret Morrison had adapted to frontier life with remarkable grace, transforming a rough military posting into something resembling civilized society. She organized social events, managed charitable activities for the soldiers' families, and served as unofficial diplomat to the handful of other officers' wives who shared their isolated existence. "The Whitmore family has sent word that they can attend the wedding," Margaret announced, her voice bright with satisfaction. "James's parents and his sister Catherine will arrive from Boston next week. It will be wonderful to have family present for such an important occasion." Elizabeth nodded appropriately while internally calculating how many people would witness her surrender to a life she had not chosen. The wedding had grown from a simple ceremony into a social event that would demonstrate the stability and respectability of British colonial society to anyone who might doubt their permanent presence in the territory. "I've also arranged for Reverend Williams from Sandwich to perform the ceremony," her father added. "He's the most senior Anglican clergyman in the region, and his presence will lend proper dignity to the occasion." The conversation continued around Elizabeth like water flowing around a stone. She smiled when expected, nodded at appropriate moments, and asked polite questions about wedding arrangements that felt increasingly like preparations for her own execution. Captain Whitmore discussed his career prospects, her parents' planned guest accommodations, and she sat in the middle of it all feeling like an observer at someone else's life. After dinner, James requested a private moment with Elizabeth on the fort's ramparts, a conversation that would have been scandalous in Boston society but passed for proper courtship in the isolated world of Fort Detroit. They walked along the wooden walkway that topped the fort's walls, looking out over the river where moonlight painted silver paths across the dark water. "Elizabeth," James began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for important announcements, "I want you to know how honored I am by your father's consent to our marriage. I believe we will have a very successful partnership." Partnership. The word struck Elizabeth as particularly telling. Not love, not passion, not even affection partnership. As if they were entering a business arrangement rather than a marriage. "I'm sure we will, James," she replied automatically, the response expected of a well-bred young woman accepting her fate with appropriate grace. "I've been thinking about our future together," he continued, apparently taking her response as encouragement. "Once this Indian business is settled, I expect to receive promotion to major. My family's shipping interests are expanding into the Great Lakes trade, and there will be opportunities for a man with military connections and a suitable wife to advance considerably." Elizabeth listened to James outline their future with the same methodical planning he brought to military campaigns. Their life together had been mapped out like a strategic objective: the houses they would live in, the social circles they would join, the children they would raise to carry on both family names. It was a reasonable, respectable, profitable future that left no room for passion or surprise, or any of the emotions that made life worth living. "That sounds very promising," she said, because some response was required and because James seemed to be waiting for her approval of his plans. "I want you to know that I understand your situation," James said, his tone becoming what he probably thought was understanding. "I know that women of your intelligence sometimes have concerns about marriage limiting their intellectual pursuits. I want to assure you that I have no objection to your continuing to read, within reason, after we're married." The condescension in his voice made Elizabeth's jaw clench. James was offering to allow her to read, within reason, as if literacy were a privilege he could grant or withdraw at will. The assumption that her intelligence was something to be managed rather than appreciated revealed everything about how he viewed their future relationship. "How generous of you," she replied, her tone carefully neutral despite the anger building in her chest. James seemed to miss the edge in her voice entirely. "I believe in being a modern husband, Elizabeth. As long as your reading doesn't interfere with your domestic duties or give you inappropriate ideas, I see no harm in it." Inappropriate ideas. Elizabeth stared out at the moonlit river and wondered what her life would become if she spent it with a man who considered her thoughts potentially inappropriate. Would she gradually learn to think smaller, to ask fewer questions, to accept limitations on her curiosity about the world? Would she become like so many military wives she had observed, intelligent women who had learned to hide their minds behind pleasant smiles and endless conversations about household management? Their conversation was interrupted by shouting from the fort's main gate. Torches blazed to life along the walls as guards responded to some disturbance, and Elizabeth could see figures moving in the courtyard below. James immediately became alert, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice taking on the military authority that made him seem more attractive than his conversation ever had. "I'll determine what's happening." But Elizabeth had no intention of staying safely out of the way while something interesting finally occurred within the fort's walls. She followed James down the narrow stairs from the ramparts, staying far enough behind to avoid his notice, but close enough to observe whatever was causing the commotion. The scene in the courtyard was unlike anything Elizabeth had witnessed during her years at Fort Detroit. A party of British soldiers had returned from patrol with prisoners, 3 Huron warriors who walked with the dignity of men who refused to be broken by capture. They were bound but not beaten, dirty from travel but holding their heads high despite their circumstances. Elizabeth found herself studying the prisoners with fascination rather than fear. She had heard about the Huron people throughout her life, but always through the filter of military reports and colonial prejudices. These men looked nothing like the savage monsters described in her father's dispatches. They appeared tired, certainly, and wary of their captors, but there was intelligence in their faces and purpose in their bearing that commanded respect despite their situation. The leader of the 3 caught her attention immediately. He was tall and lean with the kind of muscular build that came from a life spent outdoors, and he moved with fluid grace, even with his hands bound behind his back. His dark hair hung loose around his shoulders, and his face bore the high cheekbones and strong jaw that spoke of generations adapted to this harsh but beautiful land. Most striking were his eyes, dark as winter nights, but holding depths that suggested intelligence, humor, and strength that imprisonment could not diminish. As the soldiers marched their prisoners toward the fort's jail, the Huron leader's gaze swept across the gathered crowd of curious colonists. When his eyes met Elizabeth's across the crowded courtyard, something passed between them that she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. For just a moment, the noise and confusion around them faded, and Elizabeth felt as if she were seeing another human being clearly for the first time in her life. The moment lasted only seconds before the prisoners were hustled away toward their confinement, but its impact lingered long after the courtyard had returned to normal. Elizabeth stood rooted in place, her heart beating faster than she could explain, staring at the spot where the Huron warrior had been standing. "Elizabeth." James's voice cut through her distraction. He had returned from consulting with the patrol leader and was looking at her with obvious displeasure. "I told you to remain on the ramparts. This is no place for a lady." "I wanted to see what was happening," she replied, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. "Nothing that concerns you," James said firmly, taking her arm to guide her away from the scene. "Just more Indian prisoners. Your father will deal with them according to military protocol." As James escorted her back toward her family's quarters, Elizabeth glanced over her shoulder at the building where the prisoners had been taken. Somewhere behind those stone walls was a man whose single glance had affected her more profoundly than months of proper courtship with her intended husband. For the first time since her engagement had been announced, Elizabeth found herself thinking about something other than her approaching wedding. She was thinking about dark eyes that held depths she wanted to explore, about a man who carried himself with dignity even in defeat, about the possibility that there might be more to the world than the narrow confines of colonial society. That night, as she lay in her bed staring at the wedding dress that hung in her wardrobe like a symbol of predetermined fate, Elizabeth Morrison realized that everything she had accepted about her future was about to be questioned. The safe, predictable life that had been planned for her suddenly seemed less like security and more like a prison. In 3 days, she was supposed to marry Captain James Whitmore and become the perfect military wife. But first she was going to find out who the Huron prisoner was and why a single glance from a stranger had awakened something in her that years of proper courtship had never touched. The wedding dress continued to hang in the shadows, waiting for a bride who was no longer certain she would be there to wear it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Detroit's courtyard as Elizabeth Morrison made her way to the commissary, carrying a basket that served as her excuse for being anywhere near the prisoner compound. Sleep had eluded her the previous night, filled as it was with images of dark eyes and questions. She couldn't answer about her own motivations for seeking out a man she had glimpsed for mere seconds. The fort's daily routine proceeded around her with military precision. Soldiers drilled in formation, their muskets catching the early light as they practiced maneuvers that might save their lives in the ongoing conflict with Pontiac's Confederation. Officers consulted maps and dispatches, planning patrols and defensive strategies. Civilians went about their business of maintaining life in an isolated outpost surrounded by wilderness and uncertainty. Elizabeth had grown up in this world of structured purpose and clear hierarchies, but this morning everything felt different. The familiar sights and sounds seemed somehow distant, as if she were observing them from outside rather than participating in the daily rhythm of fort life. Her engagement ring caught the sunlight as she adjusted her grip on the basket, the emerald surrounded by diamonds that represented her father's hopes for her future and her own approaching surrender of any dreams beyond those approved by colonial society. Miss Morrison, called Sergeant Patrick O'Brien, the Irish-born soldier who managed the fort's prisoner facilities. "Bit early for you to be about, isn't it?" O'Brien had been at Fort Detroit for 7 years, long enough to earn her father's trust and her mother's approval as one of the more reliable enlisted men. He possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving on the frontier while maintaining the discipline required for military service. "I'm collecting supplies for my mother," Elizabeth replied, lifting her basket as evidence of her legitimate purpose. "She's planning the menu for tomorrow's dinner party." The explanation was true enough, though it hardly accounted for her decision to take the longest possible route to the commissary, a path that happened to pass directly by the stone building where the Huron prisoners were being held. "Ah, the celebration dinner before your wedding," O'Brien said with the kind of cheerful approval that made Elizabeth's stomach clench. "The whole fort's looking forward to it. Your Captain Whitmore is a lucky man, if you don't mind me saying." "So, thank you, Sergeant," Elizabeth managed, though the words felt like lead in her mouth. As O'Brien continued toward his morning duties, Elizabeth found herself slowing her pace as she approached the prisoner compound. The building was solid stone construction, designed to hold captives securely while preventing escape attempts that might endanger the fort's inhabitants. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their muskets held at ready attention, but their conversation suggested boredom rather than high alert. "Any trouble from the new prisoners?" she heard one guard ask the other. "None at all," came the reply. The Big one calls himself Thomas Blackhawk. He's been asking about reading materials, if you can imagine that. Speaks English better than half the colonists in the territory. Elizabeth stopped walking entirely, pretending to adjust the contents of her basket while she listened to their conversation. A Huron warrior who spoke fluent English and wanted reading materials was not at all what she had expected from colonial. Descriptions of savage captives, reading materials? The first guard laughed. What's an Indian want with books? Same thing anyone wants with them, I guess, the second guard replied with surprising thoughtfulness. Entertainment, information, something to pass the time. Can't say I blame him. Being locked up with nothing to do would drive me mad. The conversation continued, but Elizabeth had heard enough to make a decision that would have horrified her. Parents and scandalized everyone who knew her. She approached the guards with the confidence that came from being the commanding officer's daughter and knowing that her social position granted her certain privileges. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "I'm Elizabeth Morrison. I understand you have some new prisoners who might benefit from reading materials." Both guards straightened immediately upon recognizing her, their casual demeanor replaced by military formality. "Miss Morrison," the senior guard replied. "I'm not sure it's appropriate for a lady to be concerned with prisoner welfare." "Christian charity is always appropriate," Elizabeth said, drawing on the kind of moral authority that frontier society respected. "If these men are to remain here for any length of time, surely providing them with books or newspapers would be a humane gesture that reflects well on British civilization." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Elizabeth's request was unusual, but it wasn't technically against regulations, and refusing the colonel's daughter could have uncomfortable consequences for enlisted men. "Well, miss," the first guard said slowly, "I suppose there's no harm in it, though I'm not sure what kind of reading matter would be suitable for Indians." "The same kind that would be suitable for anyone, I imagine," Elizabeth replied firmly. "Perhaps some newspapers, or books of history or natural philosophy. I have several volumes in my personal library that might serve the purpose." What she didn't mention was her real motivation for this charitable gesture, the overwhelming need to see the man who had affected her so profoundly with a single glance. The logical part of her mind recognized that her behavior was inappropriate, even dangerous, but logic seemed to have deserted her entirely since the previous evening. "I'll need to clear this with the sergeant," the guard said uncertainly. "Of course," Elizabeth agreed. "Please tell Sergeant O'Brien that I'll return this afternoon with appropriate materials. I'm sure he'll appreciate our efforts to maintain order through constructive activity." As she continued toward the commissary, Elizabeth's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and terror at what she had just committed herself to doing. By afternoon, she would be face to face with Thomas Blackhawk, and she had no idea what she would say, or how she would explain her presence there. The commissary visit passed in a blur of automatic responses to the storekeep's questions about quantities and qualities of supplies needed for her mother's dinner party. Her mind was entirely occupied with planning her return to the prisoner compound and selecting books that might provide legitimate reason for extended conversation with a man she had never met, but couldn't stop thinking about. Back in her family's quarters, Elizabeth spent the morning hours in her father's library, ostensibly helping her mother plan the evening's entertainment, but actually selecting volumes that might interest an intelligent man regardless of his cultural background. She chose carefully a collection of English poetry, a treatise on natural philosophy, a history of European exploration in the Americas, and several recent issues of newspapers from Boston and Philadelphia. "Elizabeth, dear," her mother said, looking up from her guest list, "you seem distracted today. I hope you're not having second thoughts about tomorrow's celebration." Margaret Morrison possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of her daughter's moods that came from years of close observation. She had noticed Elizabeth's unusual behavior since the previous evening, though she attributed it to natural nervousness about the approaching wedding rather than any more disturbing possibility. "Not second thoughts, exactly," Elizabeth replied. "Carefully. I'm simply trying to process all the changes that are coming." "It's natural to feel overwhelmed," her mother said soothingly. "Marriage is a significant step, especially for a young woman of your intelligence and independence. But James is a good man who will provide well for you, and you'll find satisfaction in supporting his career and raising his children." The words were meant to be comforting, but they struck Elizabeth like physical blows. Supporting his career and raising his children, was that truly the extent of what life offered her? Would all her education, all her curiosity about the world, all her capacity for thought and feeling be reduced to those narrow purposes? "Mother," she said slowly, "were you ever uncertain about your choice to marry father?" Margaret Morrison set down her pen and studied her daughter with the kind of careful attention that suggested she recognized the importance of her answer. "Uncertain?" "Yes, I was uncertain," she said honestly. "Not about your father's character or his prospects, but about my own readiness to leave everything familiar and follow him to postings like this one. I wondered if I was strong enough for frontier life, if I would be able to create a proper home in the wilderness." "But you were never uncertain about whether you loved him?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither woman wanted to examine too closely. "Love," Margaret said carefully, "grows from respect, compatibility, and shared experiences. Your father and I developed deep affection for each other over time, and our marriage has been strengthened by the challenges we faced together. Not every marriage begins with passion, Elizabeth, but the best marriages are built on foundations more solid than intense emotion." Elizabeth nodded as if satisfied by this explanation, though it did nothing to address the turmoil in her heart. Her mother's marriage might have grown into love, but it had begun with mutual respect and compatible goals. Elizabeth felt neither respect nor compatibility with James Whitmore, only resignation to a fate that others had determined for her. The afternoon approached with agonizing slowness, but finally Elizabeth could reasonably claim errands that would take her past the prisoner compound. She gathered the books she had selected, wrapped them in brown paper to disguise their contents, and set out with her heart hammering against her ribs. The same guards were on duty, but Sergeant O'Brien had joined them, apparently having been informed of her morning request. "Miss Morrison," he said with professional courtesy, "the guards tell me you're interested in providing reading materials for the prisoners." "Yes, Sergeant. I believe that constructive occupation of their time will be beneficial for everyone involved." O'Brien studied her face as if trying to determine whether her motives were entirely pure, but Elizabeth had spent years learning to school her expression under her father's military discipline. "Very well," he said finally, "but I'll need to be present during any interaction with the prisoners, and the materials will need to be examined first to ensure they contain nothing that might aid in escape attempts." "Of course," Elizabeth agreed, though her pulse quickened at the realization that she would actually be speaking with Thomas Blackhawk within minutes. The interior of the prisoner compound was dimmer than the bright afternoon outside, and Elizabeth's eyes needed time to adjust to the changed lighting. The facility contained 3 cells, each designed to hold multiple prisoners securely while providing basic necessities for survival. The captured Huron warriors were being held in the largest cell, which contained rough wooden benches, straw, mattresses, and a barred window that provided light and ventilation. Thomas Blackhawk rose from where he had been sitting as Elizabeth and Sergeant O'Brien entered the building. Up close, he was even more impressive than he had appeared in the courtyard, tall and powerfully built, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything about their visitors in a single comprehensive glance. His clothing was worn, but clean, and he carried himself with the kind of natural dignity that no amount of imprisonment could diminish. "This is Miss Morrison," Sergeant O'Brien announced. "She's brought some reading materials that you requested." Thomas Blackhawk's gaze shifted to Elizabeth, and once again she felt the strange jolt of recognition that had affected her so strongly the previous evening. This time, however, she was prepared for it and managed to maintain her composure despite the rapid beating of her heart. "That's very kind of you, Miss Morrison," Thomas said, his English accent free and cultured in a way that surprised everyone present, except Elizabeth, who had overheard the guard's earlier conversation. "I'm grateful for any materials that might help pass the time constructively." His voice was deep and pleasant, with none of the harsh tones she had been taught to expect from enemy warriors. Instead, he spoke with the measured cadence of someone accustomed to thinking before speaking, and his words carried an intelligence that demanded respect regardless of his current circumstances. "I've brought several books that might interest you," Elizabeth replied, unwrapping her bundle. "Poetry, natural philosophy, history, and some recent newspapers from the eastern colonies." Thomas examined the materials with obvious interest, his long fingers handling the books with the care of someone who understood their value. When he looked up at Elizabeth again, his expression had changed from polite gratitude to something approaching wonder. "These are excellent choices," he said slowly. "The natural philosophy text is particularly valuable. I've heard of the author but never had the opportunity to read his work." "You're familiar with European scientific writing?" Elizabeth asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I was educated by Jesuit missionaries for several years," Thomas explained. "They believed that understanding European knowledge would help our people negotiate more effectively with colonial governments. I learned to read Latin as well as English and French." The revelation that this supposedly savage prisoner was multilingual and educated in classical literature struck Elizabeth like lightning. Everything she had been taught about the fundamental differences between European and native peoples was being challenged by a single conversation with a man who discussed philosophy with the ease of a university graduate. "That's remarkable," she said honestly. "I studied Latin as well, though I'm not sure my teachers would approve of my discussing it with." She trailed off, suddenly aware that she had been about to say something incredibly inappropriate. "With an enemy?" Thomas supplied gently, and Elizabeth was surprised to see amusement rather than offense in his dark eyes. "I didn't mean," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "It's a fair description of my current status," he said. "Though I hope it's not a permanent condition. Wars end, Miss Morrison. People who were enemies can become allies when circumstances change." Sergeant O'Brien had been listening to their conversation with growing unease, clearly uncomfortable with the level of intellectual discourse taking place between his commanding officer's daughter and a captured enemy warrior, Miss Morrison. He interrupted, "Perhaps we should conclude this visit. Your father expects you back soon." Elizabeth felt a stab of disappointment that surprised her with its intensity. She had been enjoying her conversation with Thomas Blackhawk more than any social interaction she could remember, and the prospect of returning to her ordinary routine felt like stepping back into a cage. "Of course," she said reluctantly. "I hope you find the materials useful, Mr. Blackhawk." "I'm certain I will," he replied, and something in his tone suggested he was talking about more than just books. "Thank you for your kindness, Miss Morrison. It's rare to encounter such generous consideration from strangers." As Elizabeth left the prisoner compound, she carried with her the memory of intelligent conversation and mutual respect with a man whose very existence challenged everything she had been taught about racial differences and cultural superiority. Thomas Blackhawk was nothing like the savage warrior described in military reports, and her attraction to him was based on far more than physical appearance. It was grounded in recognition of a kindred intellect and a depth of character that made her engagement to James Whitmore seem even more hollow by comparison. That evening, as she sat through another formal dinner with her fiancé, Elizabeth found herself comparing James's predictable observations about military strategy with Thomas's thoughtful comments about natural philosophy. The contrast was devastating. James spoke with the authority of someone who expected to be agreed with regardless of the merit of his ideas, while Thomas had engaged with her thoughts as if her opinions mattered and her intelligence deserved respect. "Elizabeth," James said, breaking into her distraction, "I was asking about your preferences for our wedding journey. My family has suggested we spend our honeymoon in Boston, where you can meet my relatives and become familiar with proper society." Proper society. The phrase that had once represented security and respectability now sounded like a description of prison walls, designed to contain any thoughts or feelings that might challenge established order. "That sounds lovely," Elizabeth replied automatically, though inside she was screaming at the prospect of spending her honeymoon being evaluated by James's family for her suitability as a military wife and social ornament. But even as she spoke the expected words, Elizabeth's mind was working on a different problem entirely. She needed to find a reason to return to the prisoner compound, to continue her conversations with Thomas Blackhawk, to explore the connection she felt with a man who saw her as more than just a decorative addition to someone else's life. Tomorrow was her wedding celebration dinner. In 2 days, she would marry James Whitmore and begin the life that had been planned for her since childhood. But between now and then, she was determined to discover whether the feelings stirring in her heart had any foundation in reality or were simply the desperate fantasies of a woman facing a future she had never chosen. The book she had given Thomas would need to be returned eventually, providing her with a legitimate excuse for another visit. And after that, well, she would find other reasons if necessary. For the first time in months, Elizabeth Morrison felt alive with possibility rather than resigned to inevitability, and she wasn't ready to surrender that feeling without a fight. Morning of Elizabeth's wedding celebration dinner dawned crisp and clear, with autumn leaves swirling across the fort's courtyard like nature's confetti celebrating an occasion she dreaded. Elizabeth stood before her mirror, allowing her maid Sarah to arrange her hair in the elaborate style her mother had requested, while her thoughts remained fixed on the conversation she'd shared with Thomas Blackhawk the previous afternoon. "Miss Elizabeth," Sarah said, securing another pin in the intricate coiffure, "you seem mighty distracted today. Most brides-to-be are all aflutter with excitement by now." Sarah Jenkins had been with the Morrison family for 3 years, having arrived at Fort Detroit as the wife of a soldier who died in a skirmish with Pontiac's warriors. Rather than return east to uncertain prospects, she had accepted employment as Elizabeth's personal maid, and the two women had developed the kind of comfortable relationship that existed between servant and mistress when genuine affection grew beyond formal boundaries. "I suppose I'm nervous about all the attention," Elizabeth replied, though nervousness hardly captured the turmoil in her heart. The real source of her distraction was the memory of intelligent dark eyes and a voice that spoke of poetry and philosophy with the passion of someone who understood beauty in words. "Well, you'll be the prettiest bride in the whole Michigan territory," Sarah said loyally. "Captain Whitmore won't be able to take his eyes off you." The comment struck Elizabeth as particularly ironic, since James had never really looked at her, not in the way that mattered. He saw her as a suitable wife, an appropriate ornament for his career, but he had never shown any interest in discovering who she was beneath the surface of propriety and accomplishment that made her acceptable to colonial society. Thomas Blackhawk, on the other hand, had looked at her as if she were a person worth knowing rather than a prize worth winning. The difference was so profound that Elizabeth had spent the night questioning everything she thought she knew about love, marriage, and the choices that would define the rest of her life. "Sarah," Elizabeth said carefully, "what do you know about the Huron prisoners who were brought in 2 days ago?" Sarah's hands stilled in Elizabeth's hair, and her reflection in the mirror showed obvious surprise at the unexpected question. "The Indian prisoners?" "Not much, miss. The soldiers say they were captured in a raid on their village, but they came peaceful-like when they realized they were outnumbered." "Why do you ask?" "I took some reading materials to them yesterday," Elizabeth explained, keeping her tone casual. One of them spoke excellent English. It made me wonder about their background. Reading materials? Sarah's eyebrows rose in her reflection. That was kind of you, miss, but maybe not the wisest thing. Your father wouldn't approve of you going near enemy prisoners, even for charitable purposes. The warning in Sarah's voice was gentle but clear. As someone who had lost her husband to the ongoing conflict, Sarah understood the dangers of the frontier in ways that Elizabeth, protected by her father's rank and the fort's walls, could only imagine. They're prisoners, Sarah, locked in cells under guard. What possible danger could they represent? Maybe not physical danger, Sarah replied carefully, but there's other kinds of harm that can come from associations that aren't proper for a young lady about to be married. The conversation was interrupted by Elizabeth's mother calling from the parlor, summoning her daughter to review the final arrangements for the evening celebration. Elizabeth rose from her dressing table, smoothing the deep blue silk of her gown, another expensive creation designed to showcase her suitability as a military wife. Margaret Morrison had transformed their modest parlor into something resembling a proper drawing room, with fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases and the best china displayed on polished silver trays. The guest list included every officer and his wife currently stationed at Fort Detroit, along with several prominent civilian families from the surrounding settlements. Everything looks beautiful, Mother, Elizabeth said, meaning it sincerely despite her own lack of enthusiasm for the occasion. Thank you, dear. I want tonight to be memorable, a proper celebration of your engagement and a demonstration of civilized society for our guests. Some of these frontier wives haven't seen formal entertaining in months. Margaret Morrison took pride in maintaining the standards of proper society, even in their isolated circumstances. She had brought civilization to the wilderness through sheer determination and attention to detail, creating a pocket of refinement that reminded everyone of the world they had left behind in the established colonies. Have you heard anything about the new prisoners? Elizabeth asked, attempting to sound merely curious rather than intensely interested. Only that your father considers them valuable for intelligence purposes, Margaret replied, adjusting the placement of a flower arrangement. Apparently they know details about Pontiac's movements that could be useful for our defensive planning. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Whitmore, resplendent in his dress uniform with its gold braid and polished buttons. He carried himself with the confidence of a man celebrating his own success in securing a bride who would advance his social and professional standing. Ladies, he said, bowing formally to both women, you've outdone yourselves with these preparations. The parlor looks magnificent. Thank you, James, Margaret replied warmly. Elizabeth has been such a help with the arrangements. She has quite a talent for organization. James turned his attention to Elizabeth, his blue eyes taking in her appearance with the same assessing gaze he might use to evaluate a new horse or a piece of military equipment. You look lovely, my dear, he said, the compliment automatic and bloodless. That shade of blue is very becoming. Elizabeth accepted the praise with a smile that felt increasingly false on her lips. How could she have once thought James's attention flattering when it was so obviously superficial? He noticed her dress, her hair, her appearance, but showed no interest in her thoughts, her feelings, or her inner life. Thank you, she replied, because some response was expected. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your reading habits, James continued, apparently oblivious to her lack of enthusiasm. I've decided that it would be appropriate for you to continue with light literature after our marriage novels, perhaps, or poetry suitable for ladies. I wouldn't want you to feel that marriage had deprived you of all intellectual stimulation. The condescension in his voice made Elizabeth's jaw clench. James was graciously permitting her to read novels, as if serious literature or scholarly works were beyond her capacity or beneath her station. The contrast with Thomas Blackhawk's respectful discussion of natural Philosophy was so stark that Elizabeth felt nauseated by the comparison. "How thoughtful of you," she managed, though her tone carried an edge that Margaret Morrison noticed with concern. The evening celebration began promptly at 7 o'clock, with guests arriving in their finest attire despite the limitations imposed by frontier living. The officers had polished their uniforms to perfection, while their wives wore gowns that had been carefully preserved for special occasions. The civilian guests had made equal efforts to demonstrate that wilderness living hadn't diminished their commitment to proper society. Elizabeth moved through the evening like an actress, playing a role she had never wanted to audition for. She smiled at congratulations, accepted compliments on her engagement, and made polite conversation about wedding plans that felt increasingly like preparations for her own funeral. Every exchange reminded her of the narrow boundaries that would define her life as Mrs. James Whitmore. "Elizabeth, dear," said Mrs. Catherine Henley, the wife of a prominent merchant, "you must be so excited about establishing your own household. James will be such a good provider, and you'll have the satisfaction of supporting his career advancement." "Indeed," Elizabeth replied automatically, though the prospect of spending her life supporting someone else's ambitions while abandoning her own seemed less appealing by the hour. The conversation continued around her, touching on topics that would have seemed important just days earlier, but now felt trivial compared to the questions that truly mattered. How did one choose between security and happiness? Between social acceptance and personal fulfillment? Between the life that was expected and the life that might be possible? As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself studying the married couples in attendance, searching for evidence of genuine partnership and mutual respect. What she saw instead were patterns of polite distance and careful deference, with wives supporting their husbands' conversations while rarely contributing their own thoughts or opinions. "Mrs. Morrison," said Lieutenant David Porter, James's closest friend among the junior officers, "you must be proud to see Elizabeth making such an advantageous match. James is destined for great things, and she'd be a tremendous asset to his career. An asset to his career." The phrase echoed Thomas Blackhawk's observation about wars ending and enemies becoming allies when circumstances changed. Elizabeth was being discussed as a strategic acquisition rather than a human being with her own thoughts, feelings, and aspirations. "We're very pleased with the match," Margaret Morrison replied diplomatically, though Elizabeth caught the quick glance her mother sent in her direction, as if assessing her daughter's reaction to the conversation. The evening reached its climax when James called for attention to make a formal toast to their engagement. He stood with his glass raised, looking every inch the successful military officer claiming his prize. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying the authority that made him effective in military command, "I want to thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate my engagement to Miss Elizabeth Morrison. I consider myself fortunate indeed to have won the hand of such an accomplished and beautiful young lady." Elizabeth felt every eye in the room turned toward her as James continued his speech, praising her beauty, her domestic skills, and her suitability as a military wife. Not once did he mention her intelligence, her curiosity about the world, or any of the qualities that made her an individual rather than simply a decorative addition to his life. "Elizabeth will be a tremendous support to my career," James concluded, "and I look forward to the day when she can take her proper place in the society of whatever posting the Army assigns us." The guests applauded enthusiastically, and Elizabeth rose to accept their congratulations with a grace that concealed the growing rebellion in her heart. As she stood there smiling and nodding, she couldn't help thinking about Thomas Blackhawk's comment that people who were enemies could become allies when circumstances changed. What if the reverse were also true? What if people who appeared to be natural allies were actually fundamentally incompatible? The parallel between her situation and Thomas's struck her with sudden clarity. Both of them were prisoners in their own ways. He was locked in a physical cell, while she was trapped in social expectations, that would define her entire future. The difference was that his imprisonment might be temporary, while hers was intended to last a lifetime. After the last guests had departed and the parlor had been restored to its normal arrangement, Elizabeth retreated to her room with relief. That felt like escaping from suffocation. She dismissed Sarah and sat alone in the darkness, still wearing her celebration gown but feeling as if she had attended her own wake rather than an engagement party. The wedding dress hanging in her wardrobe seemed to mock her with its pristine whiteness and elaborate construction. In less than 24 hours, she would put it on and walk down the aisle to marry a man who saw her as an acquisition rather than a partner. The prospect felt like stepping into a tomb. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. "Elizabeth?" Her mother's voice called quietly. "May I come in?" "Of course, Mother," Elizabeth replied, lighting a candle to chase away the darkness. Margaret Morrison entered wearing her dressing gown, her usually perfect hair loose around her shoulders. She looked older than Elizabeth remembered, as if the evening's entertainments had exhausted her in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. "I wanted to speak with you privately," Margaret said, settling into the chair beside Elizabeth's dressing table. "I've been watching you tonight, and I'm concerned about what I've observed." Elizabeth felt her heart begin to race. Had her mother somehow detected her growing doubts about the marriage? Had she noticed Elizabeth's distraction and lack of enthusiasm for the celebration? "I'm fine, Mother," Elizabeth said carefully, perhaps a bit overwhelmed by all the attention. "Elizabeth," Margaret said gently, "I've been married to your father for 23 years. I know what it looks like when someone is going through the motions of happiness rather than experiencing genuine joy. You look tonight like a woman, attending her own execution rather than celebrating her engagement." The accuracy of her mother's observation was so startling that Elizabeth couldn't formulate an immediate response. She stared at Margaret's face in the candlelight, seeing understanding and concern rather than the disapproval she had expected. "Marriage is a serious commitment," Margaret continued, "and it's natural to have doubts about such a significant change in your life. But what I saw tonight went beyond normal nervousness. You looked like a woman who was fundamentally opposed to what was happening to her." Elizabeth began, then stopped, unsure how to explain feelings she didn't fully understand herself. "Tell me honestly," Margaret said, her voice gentle but insistent. "Are you having serious doubts about marrying James?" The question hung in the candlelit room like a challenge to everything Elizabeth had been taught about duty, obedience, and the limited choices available to women in their society. Her mother was offering her an opportunity to speak the truth, but Elizabeth wasn't certain she was ready to face the consequences of such honesty. "I don't know," Elizabeth whispered finally. "I know I should be grateful for such an advantageous match, and I know James is everything a woman in my position should want in a husband. But I can't help wondering if there might be more to marriage than social compatibility and financial security." Margaret Morrison studied her daughter's face for a long moment before responding. "What kind of more are you thinking about?" "Intellectual partnership," Elizabeth said slowly. "Genuine respect for each other's thoughts and opinions. The kind of marriage where both people grow and learn together rather than one person simply supporting the other's ambitions." The words sounded revolutionary in the context of their society, where women's roles were clearly defined and strictly limited. But Margaret Morrison didn't immediately dismiss her daughter's aspirations as unrealistic or inappropriate. "Such marriages exist," Margaret said quietly, "though they're rare and often require significant sacrifice from both partners. The question is whether you believe James is capable of that kind of partnership." Elizabeth considered the question honestly, remembering James's condescending comments about her reading habits and his complete lack of interest in her thoughts or opinions. "No," she said finally, "I don't think he is. I think he wants a wife who will enhance his reputation and support his career without challenging him intellectually or expecting him to consider her needs as equal to his own. Margaret Morrison nodded slowly, as if Elizabeth's assessment confirmed her own observations. "Then you have a choice to make," she said simply. "You can marry James and accept the security and social position he offers, knowing that you'll spend your life supporting his dreams rather than pursuing your own. Or you can break the engagement and face the social consequences of such a decision, knowing that your opportunities for marriage and independence will be severely limited." The stark reality of her situation settled over Elizabeth like a heavy blanket. In their society, an unmarried woman had few options for supporting herself, and a woman who broke an engagement faced social ostracism that could last for years. But the alternative, a lifetime of intellectual stagnation and emotional isolation, seemed equally devastating. "I need time to think," Elizabeth said quietly. "Time is something you don't have much of," Margaret replied gently. "The wedding is tomorrow, and once you speak those vows, the choice will be made forever." After her mother left, Elizabeth sat alone in the darkness, contemplating the impossible decision that faced her. Outside her window, she could see the lights of the prisoner compound where Thomas Blackhawk was probably reading by candlelight, making the most of his temporary captivity by expanding his knowledge and understanding of the world. The contrast between Thomas's approach to adversity and her own passive acceptance of an unwanted fate struck her powerfully. He had found ways to grow and learn even in imprisonment, while she was allowing herself to be led passively toward a future that would imprison her more completely than any physical cell. Tomorrow she would marry James Whitmore unless she found the courage to make a different choice. But what alternatives were actually available to her? And was she brave enough to pursue them, even if it meant abandoning everything she had been taught to value about security, respectability, and social acceptance? The questions multiplied in her mind as she prepared for what might be her last night as an unmarried woman. In 12 hours, she would either walk down the aisle to begin a life she had never chosen, or she would find the strength to break free from expectations that had been binding her since childhood. Either way, Elizabeth Morrison knew that the woman who woke up tomorrow morning would be fundamentally different from the one who was going to sleep tonight. The only question was whether that difference would represent surrender or liberation. Elizabeth woke before dawn on her wedding day, with a clarity of purpose that surprised her. The sleepless hours had crystallized her thoughts into a single desperate plan. She would not marry James Whitmore today, not without first understanding what she would be giving up by choosing security over the possibility of something more meaningful. The fort was still quiet in the pre-dawn darkness as Elizabeth, dressed in her simplest gown and wrapped herself in a dark cloak. Her wedding dress hung in the wardrobe like a ghost of the future she was about to reject, but she couldn't bring herself to look at it. Instead, she gathered the books Thomas had finished reading, using their return as justification for what she knew was a reckless decision. The guards at the prisoner compound were different from those she had encountered before. Night shift soldiers, who looked surprised to see the colonel's daughter approaching their post at such an unusual hour. "Miss Morrison," the senior guard said, confusion evident in his voice. "Begging your pardon, but shouldn't you be preparing for your wedding?" "I need to collect the books I lent to the prisoners," Elizabeth replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I won't have time later, and I don't want to leave them behind when my circumstances change." The guard's expression suggested he found her explanation odd, but he was too well trained to question the commanding officer's daughter directly. He unlocked the heavy door and escorted her into the building, his boots echoing in the stone corridor. Thomas Blackhawk was awake, sitting beside the barred window where the first light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the cell. He looked up as Elizabeth entered, and she saw immediate concern in his dark eyes as he took in her appearance, the simple dress, the cloak, the obvious distress she was trying to conceal. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, rising to his feet with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements. "This is unexpected. I thought today was your wedding day." "It is," Elizabeth replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's why I'm here." The guard retreated to a respectful distance, though he remained within earshot as military protocol required. Elizabeth approached the cell, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the books Thomas had set aside for her. "These were very enlightening," Thomas said, his voice careful and neutral for the guard's benefit, particularly the natural philosophy text. The author's observations about adaptation in nature were thought-provoking. Elizabeth understood immediately that he was speaking in code, using the discussion of books to communicate something more personal. She looked up at his face and saw understanding there, as if he had somehow perceived her inner turmoil, despite their brief acquaintance. "Adaptation is a complex process," she replied, matching his careful tone. "Sometimes organisms must choose between familiar environments that no longer sustain them and unknown territories that might offer better prospects for growth." "True," Thomas agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. "But such choices require courage. The organism must be willing to leave behind everything it has known for the possibility of something better." The guard shifted impatiently, clearly uncomfortable with the philosophical discussion taking place between a prisoner and his commanding officer's daughter. "Miss Morrison," he said, "perhaps we should conclude this visit. Your family will be expecting you." Elizabeth felt panic rising in her chest. She had come here seeking what? Confirmation that her feelings for Thomas were real? Permission to abandon her duty to family and society? The answer to questions she couldn't even formulate clearly. "I have to go," she said, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Miss Morrison," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an urgency that made her look up at him again. "Before you leave, I want you to know that our conversations have been the most meaningful I've had in months. You have a remarkable mind, and I hope you never allow anyone to convince you otherwise." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Here was a man who had known her for less than a week, who had spoken with her for perhaps an hour in total, and yet he had seen something in her that James had never acknowledged in months of courtship. Thomas recognized her intelligence, valued her thoughts, and treated her as an equal worth knowing rather than a prize worth winning. "Thank you," she whispered, tears threatening to spill over despite her efforts to maintain control. "Whatever choice you make today," Thomas continued, his voice gentle but intense, "make it for yourself. Not for duty, not for others' expectations, but for the person you want to become." Elizabeth nodded, unable to trust her voice to respond. She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at him one final time. In his dark eyes, she saw understanding, respect, and something deeper that made her heart race with possibility and terror in equal measure. The walk back to her family's quarters felt like a journey between two different worlds. Behind her lay the stone building where a man who barely knew her had looked into her soul and seen someone worth caring about. Ahead lay the life that had been planned for her since childhood, safe, respectable, and utterly devoid of the intellectual and emotional connection she had just experienced. Elizabeth entered her room to find Sarah already preparing her wedding attire, the elaborate white gown spread across the bed like a symbol of surrender. Her mother was arranging flowers for her hair, and both women looked up with relief when she appeared. "Elizabeth, thank heavens," Margaret said, concern evident in her voice. "We were worried when we found your room empty. Where have you been?" "I needed some air," Elizabeth replied, which was true enough without being complete. "I wanted to think before everything changes." Sarah and Margaret exchanged glances that suggested they had been discussing Elizabeth's state of mind. In her absence, the conversation she had shared with her mother the previous evening had clearly left Margaret with lingering concerns about her daughter's readiness for marriage. "Sit down, dear," Margaret said gently. "We need to talk before you dress for the ceremony." Elizabeth sank into the chair beside her dressing table, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The contrast between the understanding she had just experienced with Thomas and the well-meaning but limited perspective of her family felt almost unbearable. "I know you're nervous," Margaret continued, "but I want you to understand that it's not too late to change your mind. Breaking an engagement would be difficult and embarrassing, but it wouldn't be the end of the world." The words Elizabeth had been hoping to hear struck her as both liberation and terror. Her mother was offering her a way out, but the consequences of taking it would be severe and lasting. "What would happen," Elizabeth asked quietly, "if I chose not to marry James?" Margaret considered the question carefully before responding. "Socially, it would be scandalous. You would be ostracized by polite society for some time, and your prospects for another advantageous marriage would be significantly diminished. Financially, you would remain dependent on your father's support, and your options for independence would be limited." "But I would survive it?" "You would survive it, Margaret." "Confirmed. The question is whether you would be happier as a spinster with limited prospects, or as a married woman with security, but perhaps limited emotional fulfillment." Elizabeth thought about Thomas's words about adaptation, about choosing between familiar environments that no longer sustained growth and unknown territories that might offer better prospects. The parallel to her own situation was unmistakable. "Mother," she said slowly, "what if there were a third option? What if I could find a different kind of marriage, one based on mutual respect and intellectual compatibility rather than social advantage?" Margaret's expression grew troubled. "Elizabeth, such marriages are rare, and they often require significant sacrifices. More importantly, they require finding a partner who shares those values, and such men are not common in our society." "But they exist?" "They exist," Margaret admitted. "But finding one would require time, opportunity, and considerable luck. Are you prepared to wait indefinitely for such a possibility?" Elizabeth thought about the man sitting in his cell less than 100 yards away, reading philosophy by candlelight and treating her intelligence as a gift rather than a burden. The possibility her mother spoke of wasn't theoretical, it was real and immediate and terrifying in its implications. "I don't know," Elizabeth said honestly. "I only know that I can't marry James feeling the way I do right now." Sarah, who had been listening to their conversation with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Miss Elizabeth, begging your pardon, but maybe you're overthinking this. Captain Whitmore is a good man who can provide for you well. Many women would be grateful for such a match." "I know," Elizabeth replied, "and I feel guilty for not being more grateful. But Sarah, can you understand that gratitude isn't enough? That I need to feel something more than resigned acceptance for the man I'm supposed to spend my life with?" The room fell silent as all three women contemplated the weight of the decision Elizabeth faced. Outside, the fort was beginning to stir with morning activity, and Elizabeth could hear the sounds of preparation for her wedding ceremony, soldiers polishing their dress uniforms, servants arranging flowers in the chapel, guests arriving to witness her transformation from Miss Morrison to Mrs. Whitmore. "I need more time," Elizabeth said finally. "I can't make this decision without understanding all my options." "Time is exactly what we don't have," Margaret replied gently. "The guests are arriving. James is preparing for the ceremony, and your father has already made arrangements with the chaplain. If you're going to change your mind, it needs to be now." Elizabeth stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the courtyard. She could see the chapel where she was supposed to be married in less than 2 hours, and the sight of it made her stomach churn with anxiety. She could also see the prisoner compound, where Thomas Blackhawk was probably wondering what decision she would make. "I need to speak with Father," Elizabeth said suddenly. "I need to tell him that I can't go through with this wedding." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Morrison family had worked toward. Margaret's face paled, while Sarah dropped the flower she had been arranging with an audible gasp. "Elizabeth," Margaret said carefully, "are you certain about this? Once you speak to your father, there will be no going back. The engagement will be broken, and the consequences will be immediate and severe." "I'm certain that I can't marry a man I don't love," Elizabeth replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm certain that I need to choose my own path, rather than accept the one that's been chosen for me. Beyond that, I'm not certain of anything, but I'd rather face uncertainty than guarantee my own misery." Margaret Morrison studied her daughter's face and saw a determination that had been building for days. This wasn't a momentary panic or wedding day nerves. It was a fundamental rejection of the life that had been planned for her. "Very well," Margaret said finally, "but I'm coming with you. Your father will be displeased, and you'll need support." Elizabeth felt a surge of gratitude for her mother's understanding, even as she recognized the courage it took for Margaret to support such a scandalous decision. Breaking an engagement on the wedding day would shock everyone who knew them and reflect poorly on the entire family. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, meaning it more deeply than she had ever meant anything in her life. As they prepared to leave the room, Sarah called out softly, "Miss Elizabeth, what should I do with the wedding dress?" Elizabeth turned to look at the elaborate gown one final time, seeing it now as a symbol of the path she was choosing not to take. "Put it away," she said firmly. "I won't be needing it today." The walk to her father's study felt like a march toward either liberation or disaster, and Elizabeth wasn't certain which it would prove to be. But for the first time in months, she was making the choice based on her own desires rather than others' expectations, and that felt like a victory regardless of the consequences. Behind her, the wedding dress was being carefully folded and stored away, while ahead lay conversations that would determine the entire course of her future. Elizabeth Morrison was about to discover what it meant to choose courage over comfort, possibility over security, and her own truth over society's expectations. The woman who had awakened that morning as a reluctant bride was walking toward her father's study as someone entirely different, a person willing to fight for the right to determine her own destiny, whatever the cost might be. Colonel Robert Morrison's study fell silent as Elizabeth finished speaking, the weight of her words settling over the room like smoke from a dying fire. Her father sat behind his mahogany desk, his weathered hands clasped tightly together, his gray eyes reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been disappointment deeper than any military defeat. "You want to call off the wedding," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled in the way that made seasoned soldiers nervous. 2 hours before the ceremony, with guests arriving, arrangements made, and Captain Whitmore's family already present. "Yes, sir," Elizabeth replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Her mother stood beside her, offering silent support that gave her strength to face her father's displeasure. Colonel Morrison rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the fort's courtyard, where soldiers were already beginning to gather in their dress uniforms for the wedding ceremony. The sight of the preparation seemed to increase his agitation. "Do you have any idea," he said without turning around, "what this decision will do to our family's reputation? To my standing among the officers? To our relationships with the Whitmore family and their considerable influence in Massachusetts?" "I understand the consequences, father," Elizabeth said quietly, "but I cannot marry a man I do not love or respect." "Love?" Colonel Morrison spun around, his composure finally cracking. "Elizabeth, this is not some romantic novel. This is real life, where marriages are built on compatibility, mutual advantage, and shared goals. Love, if it comes at all, develops over time through partnership and common purpose." "Then why," Elizabeth asked, gathering courage from her desperation, "have you and Mother been so happy together? Was your marriage purely a matter of convenience?" The question struck home in a way that surprised all three of them. Colonel Morrison's expression softened slightly as he looked at his wife. And Elizabeth saw a fleeting glimpse of the young officer who had courted Margaret Morrison 24 years earlier. "Your mother and I were fortunate," he admitted. "We found both compatibility and affection. But Elizabeth, such marriages are rare, and they cannot be commanded into existence. James Whitmore is a fine officer from a good family. He can provide for you, protect you, and offer you a respectable place in society. What more do you want?" "I want to be seen as a person rather than a possession," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I want a husband who values my thoughts and opinions, who treats me as an equal partner rather than a decorative addition to his career. I want to be able to grow and learn without being told that my interests are inappropriate for a lady." Margaret Morrison placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, offering support even as she watched her husband struggle with the implications of Elizabeth's decision. "Robert," Margaret said quietly, "perhaps we should consider postponing the wedding rather than canceling it entirely. Give Elizabeth time to think more clearly, and give James an opportunity to demonstrate that he can be the kind of husband she needs." "Postpone?" Colonel Morrison's voice rose with incredulity. "Margaret, there are 50 guests arriving for this ceremony. The chaplain is already here, the wedding breakfast is prepared, and James's parents have traveled from Boston specifically for this occasion. We cannot simply postpone a wedding 2 hours before it's supposed to begin." The sound of boots on the front steps interrupted their conversation, followed by a sharp knock at the door. Colonel Morrison's aide-de-camp entered with obvious reluctance, clearly aware that he was interrupting a family crisis. "Sir," the young officer said, "Captain Whitmore requests an immediate audience. He says it's urgent." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. James had somehow learned of her doubts, and now she would have to face his anger and disappointment in addition to her father's displeasure. "Send him in," Colonel Morrison ordered, his voice grim with resignation. James Whitmore entered the study in full dress uniform, his usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled and his blue eyes bright with an emotion Elizabeth couldn't immediately identify. He looked from her to her parents, clearly reading the tension in the room. "Colonel Morrison," he said formally, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I've received disturbing information that requires immediate attention." "What kind of information?" Colonel Morrison asked, clearly grateful for any distraction from the family crisis. "Intelligence about the Huron prisoners," James replied, his gaze flickering briefly to Elizabeth before returning to her father. "My informants tell me that one of them, the one called Thomas Blackhawk, has been in contact with Pontiac's forces. There's reason to believe he's been passing information about our defenses to his allies." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. The accusation was absurd. Thomas had been under constant guard, with no opportunity to communicate with anyone outside the fort. But she also recognized the dangerous implications of James's claim. "That's impossible," she said before she could stop herself. "The prisoners have been under guard constantly. They've had no contact with anyone except—" She stopped abruptly, realizing that she was about to reveal her own visits to the prisoner compound. "Except whom?" James asked, his voice taking on a sharp edge that made Elizabeth's skin crawl. "Colonel." Morrison was looking at his daughter with growing suspicion, clearly connecting her unfinished statement with her sudden reluctance to marry James. "Elizabeth," he said slowly, "have you had contact with the prisoners?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Elizabeth realized that she had walked into a trap, but she couldn't determine whether it had been set deliberately or was simply the result of unfortunate timing. "I brought them some reading materials," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "as a Christian charity." "Reading materials?" James's voice was incredulous. "Elizabeth, those are enemy combatants, not guests requiring entertainment." "They're human beings," Elizabeth replied, her anger overriding her caution. "Educated men who were captured in war, not animals to be caged without thought for their basic needs." The words revealed more about her sympathies than she had intended, and she saw understanding dawn in James's eyes, not the kind of understanding she had found with Thomas, but the cold comprehension of a military officer recognizing a security threat. "Colonel Morrison," James said formally, "I believe we have a serious problem. Your daughter has been compromised by enemy agents who have used her charitable impulses to gain intelligence about our operations." "That's ridiculous," Elizabeth protested. "I gave them books and newspapers. We discussed literature and philosophy, nothing more." "Philosophy?" James's tone was scathing. "Elizabeth, these savages don't understand philosophy. They were using your conversations to gather information about our routines, our guard schedules, our defensive capabilities." Elizabeth felt a surge of rage at James's dismissive characterization of Thomas's intelligence. "Thomas Blackhawk is more educated than most officers in this fort," she said hotly. "He speaks 3 languages, reads Latin, and has a better understanding of natural philosophy than—" She stopped again, realizing that she was revealing the depth of her conversations with Thomas and the extent of her admiration for him. Colonel Morrison's face had gone pale with understanding. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "how many times did you visit the prisoners?" 3 times, she admitted, knowing that denial was pointless now. 3 times, James repeated, his voice heavy with implications. 3 opportunities for enemy agents to extract information from someone with access to the commanding officer's private discussions. "It wasn't like that," Elizabeth protested desperately. "We talked about books, about ideas, about what?" Her father demanded. "What did you discuss with this man?" Elizabeth found herself trapped between truth and discretion. She couldn't explain that her conversations with Thomas had been about literature, philosophy, and the kind of intellectual partnership she had never found with James, without revealing the emotional connection that had developed between them. "We discussed the books I brought," she said carefully. "Natural philosophy, poetry, current events from the newspapers." "Current events," James seized on the phrase. "You discussed military affairs with enemy prisoners?" "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "We discussed scientific discoveries, agricultural developments, nothing that could possibly compromise fort security." But even as she spoke, Elizabeth realized how her innocent conversations might be interpreted by men trained to see threats and conspiracies in every unusual interaction. Her visits to Thomas, her interest in his welfare, her obvious distress about her impending marriage, all of it could be construed as evidence of divided loyalties or worse. "Colonel Morrison," James said with the formal tone he used for official business, "I recommend immediate interrogation of the prisoner in question. If he has been using your daughter to gather intelligence, we need to determine what information has been compromised." "No," Elizabeth said quickly, realizing that James's recommendation could result in harsh treatment for Thomas. "He hasn't done anything wrong." "Neither have I. This is all being blown out of proportion." "Elizabeth," her father said sternly, "you will remain in your quarters until this matter is resolved. You are not to leave this building or communicate with anyone without my express permission." The order struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. She was being placed under house arrest, treated like a security risk rather than a daughter who had made some questionable decisions. "Father, please," she began, but Colonel Morrison held up his hand to silence her. "Margaret," he said to his wife, "see that Elizabeth is confined to her room. Post a guard if necessary." Elizabeth felt the walls closing in around her. In the space of an hour, she had gone from breaking off an unwanted engagement to being accused of treason. Her attempts to find independence had resulted in imprisonment, more complete than anything she had experienced as an obedient daughter. "This is insane," she said desperately. "I've done nothing wrong except try to show basic human kindness to prisoners of war." "Basic human kindness that may have compromised fort security," James replied coldly. Elizabeth, I'm afraid your charitable impulses have been manipulated by people who understand how to exploit feminine sympathy for their own purposes. The condescension in his voice was the final straw. Elizabeth looked at the man she had been supposed to marry and saw nothing but arrogance, prejudice, and a complete inability to understand her as a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. "You're wrong about Thomas," she said quietly. "You're wrong about me, and you're wrong about what happened between us. But I don't expect you to understand, because you've never once tried to see me as anything more than a decorative addition to your career." James's face flushed with anger. "I see that your association with this savage has corrupted your judgment even more than I realized. Perhaps it's fortunate that this situation has revealed your true character before we were married." "Yes," Elizabeth replied with sudden clarity, "it is fortunate. Because I would never have been happy married to a man who considers intelligence a threat and kindness a weakness." Colonel Morrison stepped between them before the argument could escalate further. "That's enough," he said firmly. "James, I'll have the prisoner interrogated immediately. Elizabeth, you will return to your room and remain there until I decide how to handle this situation." As Elizabeth was escorted from the study by her mother, she caught sight of the chapel through the window. The wedding guests were still arriving, unaware that the ceremony they had come to witness would never take place. The flowers were still arranged, the altar still prepared, but the bride had chosen a different path entirely. In her room, Elizabeth sat on her bed and stared at the wedding dress that had been carefully put away. She had broken her engagement to avoid a loveless marriage, but her attempt at independence had resulted in accusations of treason and complete loss of freedom. Worse still, her actions had put Thomas in danger. James's accusations might result in harsh interrogation or even execution for a man whose only crime had been treating her with the respect and intellectual partnership she had craved. As she contemplated the ruins of her carefully planned rebellion, Elizabeth realized that her story was far from over. She had chosen to reject the safe path, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice. But she had also discovered what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than her appearance, to be treated as an equal rather than a subordinate. Whatever happened next, Elizabeth Morrison would never again accept less than she deserved from life or from love. The question was whether she would survive the crisis she had created long enough to find the happiness she had been seeking. Outside her window, the fort continued its daily routine, but everything had changed. The colonel's daughter had become a security risk. The perfect military wedding had become a scandal. And somewhere in the prisoner compound, Thomas Blackhawk was probably wondering whether their brief connection had been worth the price they would both pay for it. The partnership Elizabeth had dreamed of had lasted only a few conversations, but it had been real enough to transform her understanding of what was possible between two people who truly saw and valued each other. Now she would discover whether that transformation was strong enough to survive the storm that was about to break over all of them. The sound of raised voices from the courtyard drew Elizabeth to her bedroom window 3 hours after her confinement began. Below, she could see a crowd gathered around the prisoner compound, their faces animated with the kind of excitement that accompanies dramatic news in isolated communities. The wedding guests who had arrived expecting a celebration were now witnessing something far more scandalous: the interrogation of enemy prisoners accused of espionage. Elizabeth's hands gripped the window frame as she watched soldiers march Thomas Blackhawk from the stone building toward the fort's main headquarters. Even at a distance, she could see that he had been roughly handled. His clothes were torn, his face bore fresh bruises, and his usually perfect posture showed signs of physical mistreatment. The sight made her stomach clench with guilt and rage in equal measure. "Miss Elizabeth," Sarah's voice came from behind her, soft with sympathy and concern. "Your mother sent me to bring you some tea and to see how you're managing." Elizabeth turned from the window, grateful for any human contact after hours of solitary confinement. Sarah's familiar presence was a comfort in the nightmare her life had become. "How bad is it?" Elizabeth asked, accepting the tea with hands that trembled slightly. "What are people saying?" Sarah's expression was troubled as she settled into the chair beside Elizabeth's dressing table. "It's complicated, miss. The wedding guests are in an uproar, of course. Captain Whitmore's parents are demanding explanations, and some of the other officers are suggesting that the whole family has been compromised by enemy agents." The words hit Elizabeth like physical blows. Not only had her actions destroyed her own reputation, but they were now threatening her parents' standing in the military community that had been their entire world for decades. "And Thomas, Mr. Blackhawk?" Elizabeth asked, though she dreaded the answer. "They've been questioning him for hours," Sarah replied quietly. "Captain Whitmore is leading the interrogation, and he's not being gentle about it. There's talk of a court-martial, maybe even execution if they can prove he was spying." Elizabeth felt the room spin around her. The man who had treated her with respect and intellectual partnership was being tortured because of her selfish need for meaningful conversation. Her attempt to escape one form of imprisonment had resulted in Thomas facing the ultimate penalty. "It's my fault," she whispered. "All of this is my fault." "Miss Elizabeth," Sarah said firmly, "you brought the man some books and had a few conversations about philosophy. That's not treason, no matter what Captain Whitmore wants to call it." The distinction seemed increasingly meaningless as Elizabeth contemplated the consequences of her actions. Her father's career, her family's reputation, Thomas's life, all of it was being destroyed because she had been unable to accept the marriage that had been arranged for her. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her brooding. Margaret Morrison entered, her face pale with strain and her usually perfect composure showing cracks that revealed the extent of the family crisis. "Elizabeth," she said without preamble, "we need to talk. The situation has become more serious than any of us anticipated." Elizabeth set down her untouched tea and gave her mother her full attention, though she suspected that nothing Margaret could tell her would be worse than what she was already imagining. "Your father has been meeting with his senior officers," Margaret continued, settling into the chair Sarah had vacated. "There's growing pressure to make an example of this situation to demonstrate that the fort's security hasn't been compromised, and that appropriate action has been taken." "What kind of example?" Elizabeth asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "The prisoner Thomas Blackhawk is to be executed tomorrow morning," Margaret said quietly. "Your father tried to argue for a formal court-martial, but Captain Whitmore convinced the other officers that the evidence of espionage is clear enough to warrant immediate action." Elizabeth felt the world collapse around her. The man who had seen her as a person worth knowing, who had encouraged her to choose her own path, who had treated her intelligence as a gift rather than a burden, he was going to die because of her actions. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They can't do this. He's done nothing wrong." "Elizabeth," Margaret said gently, "I know you believe that, but the military sees things differently. From their perspective, an enemy warrior who gained access to sensitive information through the commanding officer's daughter represents an unacceptable security risk." "What sensitive information?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice rising with desperation. "We talked about books, about philosophy, about scientific discoveries. Nothing that could possibly help his people in warfare." Margaret's expression suggested. She understood Elizabeth's anguish but also recognized the futility of arguing against military logic during wartime. "It doesn't matter what you actually discussed," she explained patiently. "What matters is what you could have discussed, what information you had access to as your father's daughter. The perception of compromise is as dangerous as actual compromise in military terms." Elizabeth began pacing the small room, her mind racing to find some solution to the crisis she had created. There had to be something she could do, some way to save Thomas from paying the ultimate price for her rebellion against an unwanted marriage. "I'll confess," she said suddenly. "I'll tell them that I was the one who sought out information about fort defenses, that Thomas was simply an unwilling recipient of my indiscretions. They can't execute him if I take responsibility for everything." "Elizabeth, no," Margaret said firmly. "That would only make things worse. You would be accused of treason, and Thomas would still be executed as an enemy combatant who possessed sensitive information." The hopelessness of the situation settled over Elizabeth like a heavy blanket. Every option she could think of would either fail to save Thomas or result in her own destruction alongside his. "There has to be something," she said desperately. "Some way to prove his innocence, some argument that would convince them to spare his life." Margaret Morrison studied her daughter's face with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a foreign language. The depth of Elizabeth's anguish over Thomas's fate was revealing emotions that went far beyond guilt over an innocent mistake. "Elizabeth," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are your feelings for this man more than charitable concern?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Elizabeth had been taught about appropriate behavior for women of her social class. To admit romantic feelings for an enemy prisoner would be scandalous beyond redemption, but to deny them felt like betraying the only genuine connection she had ever experienced. "I don't know," Elizabeth said finally, her voice breaking with emotion. "I know that he's the only person who has ever looked at me and seen someone worth knowing rather than someone worth acquiring. I know that our conversations have been more meaningful than months of courtship with James. I know that the thought of him dying because of my actions is unbearable." Margaret Morrison closed her eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. Her daughter was describing the kind of connection that Margaret herself had been fortunate enough to find with her husband, but Elizabeth had found it with the most inappropriate person imaginable. "My dear girl," Margaret said softly, "you've fallen in love with a man who can never be part of your world. Even if he survives this crisis, even if the war ends tomorrow, society will never accept such a match. You would be ostracized completely, and he would face constant danger from people who consider him a savage regardless of his education or character." The words struck Elizabeth as both true and irrelevant. Social acceptance seemed like a trivial concern when Thomas was facing execution, and the opinions of people who judged worth by race rather than character hardly mattered to her anymore. "I don't care about society's acceptance," Elizabeth said fiercely. "I care about saving the life of a good man who has done nothing to deserve this fate." Margaret looked at her daughter with a mixture of admiration and fear. Elizabeth had developed the kind of passionate conviction that could either transform the world or destroy everything she touched, and Margaret wasn't certain which outcome was more likely. "Then we need to find a way to help him," Margaret said quietly, and Elizabeth looked up at her mother with surprise and hope. "You'll help me?" "I'll try," Margaret promised. "Not because I approve of this impossible attachment, but because I can't bear to see you suffer this way. And because executing a man based on speculation and prejudice is wrong, regardless of the political considerations." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion from the courtyard below. Elizabeth rushed to the window and saw her father striding across the open space with the purposeful gait that meant he was dealing with a crisis. Behind him followed several officers, including James Whitmore, whose expression of grim satisfaction made Elizabeth's blood run cold. "They're probably finalizing the execution arrangements," Margaret said quietly, joining Elizabeth at the window. As they watched, a new group of figures emerged from the fort's main gate, native warriors, carrying a white flag of truce. Elizabeth's heart leaped with sudden hope as she recognized the diplomatic protocols that meant Pontiac's representatives had come to negotiate. "A delegation," she breathed. "They must have learned about the prisoners." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "This could change everything. If Pontiac is willing to negotiate for the prisoners' release, Your father will have to consider alternatives to execution." Elizabeth watched the proceedings below with desperate attention, trying to read the body language and expressions of the men who held Thomas's life in their hands. The native delegation was led by a tall warrior whose bearing suggested high rank within Pontiac's confederation, and they carried themselves with the dignity of people seeking honorable resolution rather than demanding surrender. The negotiations that followed were conducted in the fort's main conference room, but Elizabeth could see movement through the windows as the discussions progressed. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, while she tried to interpret every gesture and expression for clues about Thomas's fate. Finally, as the sun was setting over the Michigan wilderness, her father emerged from the conference room with an expression that suggested significant developments. The native delegation followed, their faces showing what Elizabeth hoped was satisfaction rather than disappointment. "Something's happening," Margaret observed, pointing to the increased activity around the prisoner compound. Elizabeth watched as soldiers approached the stone building, but instead of the execution detail she had been dreading, they appeared to be preparing for prisoner transfer. Thomas Blackhawk emerged from the building under guard, but he was walking rather than being dragged, and his treatment appeared more formal than brutal. "They're moving him," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with anxiety. "But where?" The answer came within minutes as the native delegation prepared to depart the fort. Thomas was brought forward under heavy guard, but instead of being led to an execution site, he was positioned between the two groups as if he were part of the diplomatic proceedings. "A prisoner exchange," Margaret said with sudden understanding. Pontiac must have offered something valuable in return for the prisoner's release. Elizabeth felt hope surge through her chest like a physical force. Thomas might survive after all, even if it meant he would disappear from her life forever. The thought of never seeing him again was painful, but it was infinitely preferable to knowing he had died because of her actions. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, Elizabeth watched the most important moment of her life unfold in the courtyard below. The man who had changed her understanding of what was possible between two people was about to walk out of her world forever, but he would be alive. It was, she realized, the first truly unselfish wish she had ever made, to save someone else's life, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. The woman who had broken her engagement that morning was discovering what it meant to love someone more than herself. The negotiations concluded with handshakes and formal courtesies that suggested successful diplomacy. Thomas was released too. The native delegation, but before he joined their departure, he looked up at the fort's buildings as if searching for something. Elizabeth stepped closer to her window, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Thomas raised his hand in a gesture that might have been farewell or acknowledgement or promise. She couldn't tell which, but it carried enough emotion to take her breath away. Then he was gone, walking into the wilderness with Pontiac's warriors, carrying with him Elizabeth's heart and her only experience of being truly understood by another human being. The external challenges that had threatened to destroy them both had been resolved through diplomacy, but the personal cost was devastating. Elizabeth had saved Thomas's life by losing him forever, and she was left to face a future that felt emptier than any prison cell. The woman who remained at the window, watching until the delegation disappeared into the forest, was fundamentally different from the reluctant bride who had awakened that morning. She had discovered what love could be, and now she would have to learn how to live without it. 2 weeks after Thomas Blackhawk disappeared into the wilderness with Pontiac's delegation, Elizabeth Morrison discovered that love could be more devastating in absence than it had ever been in presence. She moved through the daily routines of fort life like a ghost haunting her own existence, performing the expected tasks of a colonel's daughter while her heart remained somewhere in the forest beyond the settlement's walls. The scandal of her broken engagement had settled into the kind of persistent gossip that would define her reputation for years to come. Wedding guests had returned to their homes carrying stories of the colonel's daughter, who had been compromised by enemy prisoners, and their tales grew more dramatic with each retelling. By the time the news reached Boston and Philadelphia, Elizabeth Morrison had become either a tragic victim of savage manipulation or a treasonous collaborator, depending on the political sympathies of the storyteller. James Whitmore had departed. Fort Detroit, the day after Thomas's release, his military pride wounded by the public spectacle of a broken engagement, and his romantic prospects enhanced by his heroic role in uncovering enemy espionage. Before leaving, he had made it clear that Elizabeth's behavior had revealed character flaws that made her unsuitable for marriage to any respectable officer. "You've done me a considerable favor," he had told her during their final conversation, his voice cold with wounded vanity. "Better to discover your disloyalty before the wedding than after. I'm sure I'll find a more suitable wife among the ladies of Boston, someone who understands the difference between Christian charity and treason." Elizabeth had listened to his condemnation with growing relief rather than regret. James's departure removed the last pretense that their relationship had ever been based on mutual affection or respect. His inability to see her as anything more than a potential asset to his career had been the foundation of her rebellion, and his vindictive response to her rejection confirmed that she had made the right choice. Regardless of the consequences, but understanding that she had been right to break the engagement, did nothing to ease the ache of losing Thomas. Every morning, Elizabeth woke hoping that her feelings would prove to have been temporary infatuation that would fade with time and distance. Instead, she found herself remembering conversations that had lasted mere minutes with the clarity of someone recalling sacred texts, the way Thomas had looked at her when she discussed natural philosophy, as if her thoughts were valuable contributions rather than amusing diversions. The respect in his voice when he spoke of her intelligence, without condescension or surprise that a woman might possess serious intellectual interests. The gentle encouragement he had offered when she faced the choice between security and self-determination. Most painful of all was the memory of his final glance from the courtyard, carrying recognition and regret and something deeper that she couldn't name but would never forget. In that moment, Elizabeth had understood that their connection had been real for both of them, not the romantic fantasy of a sheltered woman seeking escape from an unwanted marriage, but genuine recognition between two people who saw and valued each other completely. "Miss Elizabeth," Sarah said gently, entering the room with morning tea and the kind of careful cheerfulness that had characterized everyone's interactions with her since the scandal broke. "Your mother requests your presence in the parlor. She has a visitor." Elizabeth looked up from the book she had been pretending to read, the same volume of natural philosophy that Thomas had found so engaging during their brief acquaintance. She had been rereading passages they had discussed, trying to see them through his eyes and maintain some connection to the intellectual partnership they had shared. "A visitor?" Elizabeth asked, unable to muster much interest in social calls that would inevitably focus on her ruined reputation and uncertain future. "A fur trader named William Carson," Sarah explained. "He's just returned from Pontiac's, Maine. Campen has news that your mother thinks you should hear." Elizabeth's heart began beating faster at the mention of Pontiac's camp. William Carson was one of the few white men who moved freely between the native settlements and colonial outposts, serving as an informal diplomat and source of intelligence. For both sides of the ongoing conflict, she dressed quickly and made her way to the parlor, where she found her mother entertaining a weathered man in his 50s, whose buckskin clothing and graying beard marked him as someone who spent more time in the wilderness than in civilized settlements. Carson possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from surviving on the frontier through adaptability and respect for all the peoples who called it home. "Miss Morrison," Carson said, rising as she entered the room. His manner was respectful, but informal, lacking the rigid protocol that characterized most interactions with military families. "Mr. Carson," Elizabeth replied, settling into the chair her mother indicated. "Sarah tells me you have news from Pontiac's camp." Carson's weathered face grew serious as he studied Elizabeth's appearance. She wondered what he saw: a disgraced woman whose romantic folly had nearly caused a diplomatic incident, or someone genuinely concerned about the fate of a man she cared about. "I do indeed," he said carefully, "though I'm not sure how much of it you'll find comforting." Elizabeth felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "Is Mr. Blackhawk well?" "Thomas Blackhawk is alive and unharmed," Carson said quickly, apparently recognizing her distress. "But his situation is complicated." Margaret Morrison leaned forward with interest. "What kind of complications?" Carson accepted the cup of coffee Margaret offered and settled back in his chair, as if preparing for a long explanation. The prisoner exchange that secured Blackhawk's release came at a significant cost to Pontiac's Confederation. They gave up 3 captured British officers and agreed to a temporary cessation of raids against colonial settlements. Such concessions don't come without political consequences. "What does that mean for Thomas?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected the answer would be difficult to hear. "It means he's being held responsible for creating the crisis that required such expensive negotiations," Carson explained. "Some of Pontiac's war chiefs believe that Blackhawk allowed himself to be compromised by his association with a colonial woman, and they question his loyalty to their cause." The words hit Elizabeth like physical blows. Not only had her actions nearly cost Thomas his life, but they had also damaged his standing among his own people. Her attempt to escape the constraints of colonial society had resulted in Thomas facing suspicion and possibly exile from the community that had raised him. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "He did nothing wrong. Our conversations were about books and ideas, nothing that could have helped or harmed anyone." Carson's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Miss Morrison, fairness has little to do with politics during wartime. The appearance of compromise can be as damaging as actual betrayal, especially when it involves relationships that cross cultural boundaries." Margaret Morrison set down her coffee cup with unusual force, her face flushed with anger. "Are you saying that Thomas Blackhawk is being punished by his own people for showing basic human courtesy to my daughter?" "I'm saying that wartime creates pressures that make normal human relationships dangerous," Carson replied diplomatically. "Both sides view any connection between their people and the enemy with suspicion, regardless of the innocent nature of that connection." Elizabeth felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like a heavy cloak. Her rebellion against an unwanted marriage had created consequences that extended far beyond her own life, affecting Thomas's standing among his people and potentially destroying the respect he had earned through years of service to his community. "Is there anything that can be done?" she asked desperately. "Some way to prove that Thomas did nothing to compromise anyone's security?" Carson studied her face with the careful attention of someone evaluating motivations and character. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because his expression softened slightly. "There might be," he said slowly, "but it would require considerable courage from someone willing to testify about the true nature of those conversations." Elizabeth felt hope stir in her chest. "What kind of testimony?" "Pontiac's counsel is willing to hear evidence about what actually transpired between you and Blackhawk," Carson explained. "If someone could provide detailed accounts of your discussions, proving that they focused on scholarly matters rather than military intelligence, it might be enough to restore his standing within the Confederation." "Someone," Margaret Morrison repeated meaningfully. "You mean Elizabeth would have to appear before Pontiac's council herself?" Carson nodded gravely. "It's the only way to provide the kind of first-hand testimony that might clear Blackhawk's name. But Miss Morrison needs to understand what such an action would entail." Elizabeth leaned forward eagerly, ready to agree to anything that might help Thomas, but Carson held up his hand to stop her. "Appearing before Pontiac's council would mean traveling deep into territory controlled by people who consider your father's soldiers their enemies," he continued. It would mean facing questioning from war chiefs who have lost friends and family to British military actions. Most importantly, it would mean openly acknowledging your relationship with Black Hawk in a way that would destroy any remaining possibility of acceptance in colonial society. The implications of Carson's proposal settled over the room like morning mist. Elizabeth was being offered a chance to save Thomas's reputation, but at the cost of completely abandoning her own life among the people who had raised her. How would such a journey even be possible? Margaret asked practically. Elizabeth can't simply walk into the wilderness alone. I would escort her, Carson replied. I have safe passage agreements with all the tribes in the region, and my neutrality in the conflict is respected by both sides. But Mrs. Morrison, you need to understand that if your daughter takes this step, there would be no coming back. Colonial society would view her appearance before an enemy council as the final proof of her treason. Elizabeth felt her heart racing as she contemplated the choice Carson was offering her. She could remain at Fort Detroit, accept the social ostracism that would gradually fade over time, and eventually rebuild some kind of respectable life within the constraints of colonial expectations. Or she could risk everything to help the man who had seen her as more than just a decorative addition to someone else's plans. When would we need to leave? She asked, ignoring her mother's sharp intake of breath. Elizabeth, Margaret said urgently, you can't be seriously considering this. You would be throwing away everything, your family, your future, your safety for a man you've known for less than a week. I'm considering it because it's the right thing to do, Elizabeth replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Thomas is facing punishment for something that was entirely my responsibility. If my testimony can clear his name, then I have an obligation to provide it. Carson watched the exchange between mother and daughter with the interest of someone who had observed many difficult decisions during his years on the frontier. Miss Morrison, he said quietly, I need you to be completely honest about your motivations. Are you doing this out of guilt, or are your feelings for Black Hawk deeper than you've admitted? The question demanded the kind of honesty that Elizabeth had been avoiding even in her private thoughts. She looked at the faces of the two people waiting for her answer, and realized that the time for self-deception had passed. Both, she said simply. I feel guilty because my actions created this crisis, but I care about Thomas in ways that I never cared about James Whitmore. Our conversation showed me what it could be like to have a true partner, someone who values my thoughts and treats me as an equal. I may never see him again after clearing his name, but I can't live with myself knowing that he's suffering because of my actions. Margaret Morrison closed her eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. Her daughter was describing the kind of love that Margaret herself had been fortunate enough to find, but Elizabeth had found it with someone who could never be part of her world. If you do this, Margaret said quietly, you'll be choosing him over everything else, your family, your future in colonial society, any chance of a normal life. Are you prepared for such a sacrifice? Elizabeth thought about the question seriously, weighing the life she would be abandoning against the possibility of helping someone who had treated her with more respect in a few conversations than James had shown in months of courtship. I'm prepared, she said finally, because for the first time in my life, I'm making a choice based on what I believe is right rather than what others expect of me. Carson nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had hoped to hear. Then we leave at dawn, he said. Pack lightly and dress for wilderness travel. The journey to Pontiac's main camp will take 4 days, and we'll need to move quickly to avoid British patrols. As Carson departed to make preparations for their journey, Elizabeth sat alone with her mother in the parlor where she had entertained James Whitmore's marriage proposal just weeks earlier. Everything familiar about her life was about to disappear, replaced by uncertainty and danger in pursuit of something she couldn't even name. I don't understand this choice, Margaret said softly, but I can see that you've thought it through carefully. I pray that whatever you find at the end of this journey will be worth everything you're giving up to reach it. Elizabeth looked around the room that had been her world for 22 years, memorizing details she might never see again. Tomorrow she would begin a journey that would either restore Thomas's honor or result in her own death in the wilderness. Either way, she would be choosing her own path for the first time in her life, following her heart rather than society's expectations. The woman who had broken her engagement to avoid a loveless marriage was about to discover whether love could truly conquer the barriers that divided two worlds at war. The council fire crackled in the center of Pontiac's main camp as Elizabeth Morrison stood before the assembled war chiefs, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that matched the distant drums echoing through the forest. 4 days of grueling travel through wilderness paths had brought her to this moment, the chance to save Thomas Blackhawk's honor at the cost of everything she had ever known. The journey with William Carson had been a revelation in itself. Away from the rigid constraints of fort society, Elizabeth had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed. She could navigate treacherous river crossings, sleep under stars without terror, and find strength in solitude that had nothing to do with social acceptance or family approval. The woman who emerged from the wilderness was fundamentally different from the reluctant bride who had broken her engagement weeks earlier. Now, facing Pontiac himself, the legendary war chief whose name struck fear into colonial hearts, Elizabeth felt the weight of two worlds resting on her testimony. The assembled leaders represented tribes from across the Great Lakes region, men who had lost brothers and sons to British military campaigns, and they regarded her with the kind of careful attention reserved for potential threats. Thomas sat among the accused, his face carefully neutral but his dark eyes reflecting emotions Elizabeth couldn't interpret. He looked older than she remembered, worn by weeks of suspicion and isolation from the community that had raised him. When their gazes met across the firelight, she saw surprise and something that might have been gratitude, but also concern for her safety that touched her heart more deeply than any declaration of love. Pontiac rose from his position beside the fire, his bearing commanding the immediate attention of everyone present. He was smaller than Elizabeth had expected, but possessed the kind of natural authority that made physical size irrelevant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Elizabeth Morrison," he said in heavily accented but perfectly clear English, "you have traveled far from your father's fort to speak for Thomas Blackhawk. My council wonders why a colonial woman would risk so much for a man her people consider an enemy." The question cut to the heart of everything Elizabeth had been struggling to understand about her own motivations. She took a deep breath and stepped closer to the fire, letting its light illuminate her face as she chose her words carefully. "I came because Thomas Blackhawk is not my enemy," she said clearly, her voice steadying as she spoke. "He is a man of honor who treated me with respect when others in my world saw me only as property to be acquired. Our conversations were about books and ideas, about the pursuit of knowledge that recognizes no boundaries between peoples." A murmur ran through the assembled chiefs, and Elizabeth saw several of them exchange meaningful glances. Pontiac raised his hand for silence before speaking again. "You say Thomas Blackhawk treated you with respect, but our war chiefs believe he allowed himself to be weakened by soft feelings for a woman from the people who would destroy us. How do you answer this accusation?" Elizabeth felt anger rise in her chest at the suggestion that Thomas's kindness was weakness. "Thomas Blackhawk's strength comes from his ability to see past the hatred that blinds others," she replied firmly. "He could have used our conversations to gather information about the fort's defenses, but he never asked a single question about military matters. He could have encouraged my sympathy to gain better treatment, but he accepted his imprisonment with dignity. The weakness lies not in showing kindness to an enemy, but in being unable to recognize honor when it comes from an unexpected source." The words rang out across the camp with the authority of absolute conviction. Elizabeth was no longer the sheltered colonel's daughter seeking escape from an unwanted marriage. She was a woman defending someone she loved against accusations. That struck at the core of his character. Thomas Blackhawk looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat. In his eyes, she saw recognition not just of her testimony, but of the transformation she had undergone to deliver. If the woman standing before Pontiac's counsel was someone who had chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over security. "You speak of love," Pontiac observed, his keen eyes reading emotions Elizabeth thought she had been hiding. "But love between enemies in wartime brings danger to both peoples. What would you have us do with such feelings?" The question demanded honesty that would determine not just Thomas's fate, but the possibility of any future they might share. Elizabeth looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, men who had fought against her father's soldiers, who had lost family members to colonial expansion, who had every reason to view her presence as evidence of Thomas's disloyalty. "I would have you judge Thomas Blackhawk by his actions, not by my feelings," she said quietly. "He has served your people faithfully for years. His capture was the result of military necessity, not betrayal. His conversations with me revealed his intelligence and education, qualities that make him valuable to your Confederation. If my testimony can clear his name, then I am grateful. If loving him makes me your enemy as well, then I accept that consequence." The silence that followed her words stretched across the camp like a held breath. Elizabeth had just confessed her love for Thomas before an assembly of his peers, acknowledging feelings that made her forever an outsider in colonial society, while claiming no right to acceptance among his people. Pontiac studied her face for a long moment before turning his attention to Thomas. "Thomas Blackhawk, you have heard this woman's testimony. Do you accept her words as truth?" Thomas rose slowly, his movements carrying the fluid grace Elizabeth remembered from their first meeting in the fort's courtyard. When he spoke, his voice was steady but filled with emotion that made several of the war chiefs lean forward with interest. "I accept her words as truth," he said formally. "But more than that, I accept Elizabeth Morrison as a woman of courage, who has proven her character through actions rather than words. She has risked everything to defend my honor when her own people would condemn her for speaking my name. If the council finds me worthy of trust, I ask permission to offer her the protection of marriage according to our customs." The proposal struck Elizabeth like lightning. Thomas was not just accepting her testimony, he was offering her a place among his people, a chance to build the kind of partnership they had glimpsed during their brief conversations in captivity. Pontiac's weathered face showed what might have been amusement as he observed the emotions playing across both their faces. "You would marry this colonial woman? Take her into our community as one of our own?" "If she will have me," Thomas replied, his eyes meeting Elizabeth's across the fire. "And if the council grants permission for such a union." Elizabeth felt tears gathering in her eyes as she understood what Thomas was offering. Not just marriage, but complete acceptance into a world that would value her intelligence, respect her choices, and allow her to grow into the person she was meant to become. The council deliberated for what felt like hours, their discussions conducted in languages Elizabeth couldn't understand, but with gestures and tones that suggested serious consideration of unprecedented questions. Finally, Pontiac rose and addressed them both. "The council finds that Thomas Blackhawk acted with honor throughout his capture and imprisonment," he announced formally. His conversations with Elizabeth Morrison were those of an educated man sharing knowledge, not a spy gathering intelligence. His name is cleared of all suspicion. Elizabeth felt relief flood through her chest, followed immediately by uncertainty about her own fate. "Furthermore," Pontiac continued, "the council recognizes that love recognizes no boundaries of race or nation. If Elizabeth Morrison chooses to remain among us as Thomas Blackhawk's wife, she will be welcomed as a daughter of our people. But she must understand that such a choice cannot be undone. There will be no returning to her former life. The words hung in the smoky air like a final challenge. Elizabeth looked at Thomas, seeing in his face the same hope and fear that filled her own heart. They were being offered something unprecedented, the chance to build a life together that honored both their backgrounds while creating something entirely new. "I choose Thomas Blackhawk," Elizabeth said clearly. "I choose the people who would welcome me as family, rather than those who would condemn me for following my heart. I choose love over fear, partnership over ownership, growth over stagnation." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Elizabeth had ever experienced. Instead of the elaborate Anglican wedding that had been planned with James Whitmore, she exchanged vows with Thomas beside the council fire, speaking promises in both English and Huron, while the assembled chiefs witnessed their commitment. As dawn broke over the forest, Elizabeth Morrison Blackhawk stood with her husband, looking out over the lake that would be their new home. The woman who had once been terrified of losing social acceptance had found something far more valuable, a partner who saw her completely and loved what he found. Years later, their children would grow up bilingual and bicultural, serving as bridges between two worlds that their parents had helped bring closer together. The story of the colonial woman who broke her engagement to marry a Huron warrior became legend in both communities, proof that love could indeed conquer the barriers that seemed impossible to cross. Elizabeth had sought escape from an unwanted marriage and found instead the kind of partnership she had never dared dream possible. The greatest transformation had not been in her circumstances, but in her understanding of what was worth fighting for and what was worth sacrificing to achieve it. Love had conquered all, not through magic or divine intervention, but through the courage of two people who recognized something precious in each other and refused to let the prejudices of their time destroy it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.